Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon. Welcome to Cooking by Heart,
where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with.
Just the best.
I couldn't believe the tastes and the flavors.
Lydia Bastianich. Hi, Chris. Susan Sarandon.
And the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives.
I was the one sort of like mommy dearest.
Today, we're fittingly coming to you from JP's Diner, smack dab in the middle of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. My guest today is federal judge Joseph R. Goodwin. Goodwin graduated first in his law school class at West Virginia University and was editor of the Law Review, to everyone's astonishment, including his. He then founded his own law firm. He practiced law for 25 years and he became chairman of the West Virginia Democratic Party, and in 1995 was nominated as a United States District Court judge by President Clinton. He was confirmed by the Senate that year and has served on the court since. But I think his most important accomplishment was his performance as Friar Lawrence to my Romeo in our college production of Romeo and Juliet at West Virginia University. I take great pleasure in introducing my good friend, Joe Bob Goodwin. Judge Goodwin.
Hi, Chris.
How are you?
I'm just great. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Are you in chambers? Is that where you are?
I am. I'm actually in a conference room, which is right off of my main office.
Oh, because a few minutes ago when we were sort of talking with each other, you were making a ruling literally as we were talking?
I was.
Or a motion?
I've got a criminal trial starting tomorrow morning at 9:00, and a motion was sent in by the defendant.
Yeah.
And I've been doing this a while now, so I was able to rule on it.
Well, folks, those of you who are not seeing this podcast on video, Judge Goodwin looks like the perfect judge. He's got the rimless spectacles, solid white hair, trusted authority figure. That's him right there.
Well, I'm not so sure it was always that way. I started graying very young, in my 30s, and I tried dyeing it, but it turned green, and I gave up. We just went to white.
Yes, I think you made a good choice. Part of this podcast, or at least the roots of this podcast, are a lot about where we come from. And I'm interested in you're giving us a little background about where you grew up, Smalltown, West Virginia.
Well, I grew up in a town a little bit smaller than yours.
Yeah.
You grew up in Beckley, West Virginia. I grew up in a town called Ripley, less than 5,000 people. It's still less than 5,000 people. My dad was a lawyer there. He was mayor for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And I was kind of a town kid, and every thing around it was farming, a farming community.
Right.
So it was a typical 40s and 50s small town America.
A diverse town?
Not at all. Not at all. There was only one African-American family in the entire county. And by the time I was in grade school, only one member of that family was still there. And it was even less diverse, not less, but similarly diverse religious and other groups.
Ethnicities?
I didn't know what a Muslim was. I knew that one fellow was Jewish, and I knew that some people called Catholics went to a church in Ravenswood, which was 14 miles away. It was that isolated.
Right. Yeah, it's slightly different, but I think also our experience in West Virginia was there was much more of a coexistence, I think, with, at least in my town, with African-American families. I know we had neighbors who were right next to us who were African-American. And there was definitely a division in terms of the parts of town. There was a part of town that was much more of an African-American part of town, had its own school. And when desegregation came, it came more slowly for that reason. But tell me then about what it was like at home, since we're talking about food, Judge. What it was like at your house at dinner time. You had siblings,
Well,
yes?
I did. I had two brothers. My next brother, I was the oldest. My next brother was 14 months younger than I, and then a younger brother a couple years younger than that.
Right.
All three ended up practicing law together. But in terms of meals, it was meat and potatoes. We were wartime kids. I was born in 42, and we ate, canned foods. Frozen foods hadn't really come along yet.
Right.
I remember when the family got in a man freezer and bought a half a side of beef and filled it up. That was a miracle.
Right.
We had canned asparagus, which made me miss out on the experience of asparagus until I was at least 30.
For a long time, I remember canned asparagus too, because there wasn't that much fresh vegetation except in the summertime when people had gardens. You guys had gardens, did you?
We had gardens, and we had neighbors that had gardens. And our next door neighbor raised chickens, and he liked to torture us by demonstrating how you killed a chicken with a hatchet on a tree stump and let the chicken then run around with it headless. It was gruesome, and I probably shouldn't have brought it up on your podcast.
No, please. That's quite all right. We're talking about the entire experience of food, not just the sunny side. In fact, there was an abattoir in the back of my dad's restaurant, and I had a lot of the same experience because when we would drive into the alley behind the restaurant, the abattoir was literally 20, 30 feet away. And there were chickens hanging up, headless chickens hanging up on hooks with their feet still kind of flapping around. Those of you who find this distasteful, I apologize, but that's part of the food experience, folks. And so the food itself was pretty much sort of drab, all-American kind of bland.
It was meat. It was what you would probably get at your dad's restaurant, but not as good, because my mother was a good cook, but not as good as your dad.
And my dad also got the meat fresh. He got, a whole side of beef. He'd butcher it and make all the cuts of meat. And we got everything fresh all the time. And the times that I got to eat there, I ate there every other week. So I got whatever I wanted, which was really quite extraordinary. Was there considering that there were three boys at the table, was it a rowdy table?
No, that wasn't permitted. It was a more formal time for dinner back in those days.
Right.
You were meant to sit down and be ready to eat at 5:00 in the evening, because that's what time my dad got home, or 5 after.
Right.
And we were meant to be ready to eat when he got there. And we were taught table manners at a young age, taught to set the table, where to put the fork and the knife and the spoon.
Right.
And we all were encouraged to join in the conversation, and we weren't not to interrupt each other. So it was a more formal environment, more strict than kids would put up with nowadays.
I know. It was very much the same at our table as well. Children were to be seen but not heard. Except, you probably had more conversations at your table. At our table, we talked about the dinner. Basically, we talked about food. We didn't talk about anything else.
Well, by the time I was a little older, I got $1 a week allowance, and I would spend it buying 10 comic books. And my dad was appalled by that until one day I was talking to him about radar, which I'd read about in a comic book. And after I told him about what I knew about radar, he was all for reading comic books.
But not books about radar. No.
Not books about radar.
No. Did you guys eat Spam?
Well, We liked spam a lot until my dad came back from the Navy at the end of World War II, and he had nothing but spam when he was on shore in New Guinea.
Right.
And he refused to have spam in the house, so it was banned.
It was banned.
I'll tell you a funny story about New Guinea.
Yeah.
He was on the beach there. My uncle, who was very close in age to my dad, was
They
also
were both in the Navy.
Both in the Navy.
Yeah.
Both lawyers. And as far as they knew, they were on opposite sides of the world. But one day, my dad was coming out of the tent on the beach in New Guinea, which was serving as an officers' club. And he ran into a guy, and he said it was about to take a swing at him. And it turned out to be my uncle. And
his brother.
It was a big event because it made the wire services in the New York Times that brothers had run into each other in New Guinea.
Right. Not knowing that either was there.
Having no idea.
Right. But then
my uncle took him out to the ship where they serve steak and not spam.
You know, it's interesting because my brother was a gourmet cook. He had 400 cookbooks, right? And one of his favorite dishes was fried spam. He loved it. Now, he made Thai food. He made all sorts of exotic dishes constantly. You know, he was constantly looking for different food experiences, but his great food experience was fried spam. And if by the way, if none of our listeners know what spam, or a few of our listeners don't know what spam is, it was kind of a ground up meat product, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it had a very specific smell to it. I can't think of anything that exists now that even comes close to it. But I hear it's making a comeback, by the way.
It is, and it has completely different taste cold as opposed to fried. So it's really two different dishes, and it is you may know this, a very favorite dish in the Philippines. A lot of Philippine cooking is based on spam.
Really?
It may have had something to do with World War II. I hadn't thought.
Probably. Yeah. Were you a picky eater?
No, I didn't have that opportunity. I was told at every meal that there were children in China that were starving, and I was meant to eat what was on my plate and clean it up.
Right, the starving children in China gambit. That one worked all the time with me too. I just had that picture in my head, and I scarfed it down.
I blame that for the extra 15 pounds I'm carrying.
Now?
Yes.
You have a long memory. Your body has a long memory.
I'm still cleaning my plate.
Now, let's get back to the garden, because I have a big garden, and I love gardening. But you mentioned to me once that you worked in the garden when you were a kid?
Oh, I did. Yeah, sure. I hoed corn and picked beans, strung the beans. You know, as I grew up, I continued to work in the garden.
Right.
After law school, I had my own garden. I still like it. I've moved to the big city now, all of 50,000 people. And,
right.
I don't have a garden.
Now, did you ever eat straight from the garden? Like when you were picking things, did you eat then?
Yeah, I'm sure, being a West Virginia boy, you did the same thing I did, was take a salt shaker straight out to the tomato patch.
Yep.
Pick ripe tomato and sit there and eat it. And there still is nothing better. Nothing
in the world like a fresh tomato right off the vine, a little salt right there, and you just chomp down. Now, were there other people around when you guys were growing up who were cooking as well as your mom?
My cousin, who was close to my mother, came back from the war with a Scottish bride, and she was a wonderful woman, and she loved to cook, and she did a lot of cooking at our house. And I remember in particular, she made fried fish and chips, and she was really good at it. And I still use your recipe. It's not very complicated.
What is it?
Well, self-rising flour with the addition of about a half a teaspoon of baking powder,
Right.
and then mix it with water until it will run off of the fish fillet, but cling to it. I don't know about the thickness of syrup.
Yep.
And then fry it in very hot grease, and you have
And that's it.
fried fish. Yeah.
What kind of fish was available then in Ripley?
In Ripley, it was frozen by the fillet of sole.
Oh, okay. Not cod or anything.
Well, I guess fillet of sole and cod are somewhat the same. I don't know.
Cod has a little more sort of deep flavor to it than sole.
Okay.
Sole's a little blander. And also, once you talked about this great bread recipe.
Yeah, my wife's father was a family physician in Buchanan, West Virginia, another small town, although they had a housekeeper. She was a patient of his from out in the country in Upshur County, and they hired her, and she came and lived with them and did cooking. She was a full-time housekeeper. And she made the most delicious homemade bread, and they had it for every meal. And I wanted to know how to bake it, but she didn't read or write, and she'd never
totally illiterate.
Totally. And so I had to watch her make the bread, and when she dumped the flour into the big bowl, I had to take it back out by the glass bowl and count the number of glasses. And I did the same thing.
Would she take handfuls of flour?
No, actually, I took a water glass.
No, but I mean, how did she measure it?
Oh, she just dumped it in from the flour sack.
Oh.
It was not an exact science of baking.
Right.
I guess the professional bakers now would call it granny bread, but it's wonderful. It has lots of Crisco, lots of sugar. She put milk on the stove, about 4 quarts of milk, and then you heat it up until it's lukewarm. She said lukewarm. And then you add that and lukewarm water with yeast.
Right.
As I recall, 2 cakes of yeast, or maybe 3. I can't recall.
Right. None of this dry yeast stuff.
No. That's too fancy.
Yeah. And the bread is totally delicious, right?
It's fantastic. I attribute.
You still make it?
I do. I attribute the good qualities to all the Crisco and sugar. Absolutely.
And as unhealthy as it can be, not a scintilla of whole grain in there.
Not a bit. And the Crisco is measured into, it's about 5 pounds of flour.
Whoa.
If you weigh it, and you take 5 kitchen spoons, about a big kitchen spoon.
Right.
Heaping, and you take 3 of those into that 5 pounds of flour, and then 3 of those heaping full of sugar, and a tablespoon heaping of salt,
right,
and the lukewarm milk,
right, cow warm.
You got it.
Right. She probably grew up on a farm.
She did, and
Probably
I think the object was to get the milk, as you said, cow warm.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man. Well, the next time you make that bread, will you freeze some for me, and we'll have some together. We'll toast bread.
I promise I will.
Now,
only if you ship me fresh produce from your farm.
Oh, okay. It's a deal. Now, you and I were theater wonks in college, and I'm going to segue a little bit here because it interests me that how the theater and law are related in any way, or are they? How did you get into law? I mean, I know it's a family business, but...
Well, I think it's 90% of it's attributable to my lack of talent in theater. I enjoyed very much being a theater major in college, as you'll recall.
Yes.
I kind of majored in play rehearsal and drinking beer.
Right.
And barely graduated, never much of a student. And I had signed up for ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps.
Right.
Only because they paid $27 a month or something. And I found out to my surprise that meant that after I graduated, I had to go in the Army.
Oh,
and if
right.
I hadn't done that, I would have been a starving actor and probably then something. I would have waited tables for a very long time.
Yes, yes. So how did that progress to law school?
It was during the Vietnam War, and I was in at a time you got promoted pretty fast. So,
why?
Well, company grade officers were getting killed at a very rapid rate, and so I made captain in 2.5 years.
Oh,
and which was good because I could then get paid at the captain's wages. Anyway, I was about ready to get out of the Army, Chris, after doing my duty, and I didn't have anything to do. I hadn't given it much thought. My future planning was not at my strong suit. And I was talking to my brother on the phone, and he was in law school. And he recommended that I go to law school. And I said, I've got a 2.6 overall in theater. I don't think any law school that has any respect for itself will allow me to go through the door. And he said, they've got this new test. It's called the Law School Aptitude Test. And so I signed up, and I got a little booklet in the mail after I signed up for the test. And it had in the back, it had a sample test.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down at the dining room table in my little military housing unit, and I took the sample test, and I got all of them right. Well, that had never happened in my entire life.
Your entire academic career, right?
Yeah, I just was out of sync. So I thought, well, they call it an aptitude test. I'll try it. And I took the aptitude test, and I got a really high score. And I thought, well, if it really is what it's supposed to be, I'll go to law school and try it. And I knew from the moment that I sat down in my first class in 10 minutes, I knew I was in the right place and I'd found the right job.
You'd found your calling.
I truly had that almost spiritual experience with the law, and I love it as much now as I did then. And that's why I'm still working at my age.
Well, yeah, you're blessed in that way, and so am I, by the way, that we both found what we wanted to do early enough that we didn't have to live a life of abject misery, doing something we didn't want to do.
But you knew you were a good actor when you were in college, and you were nominated for an Academy Award in about 5 minutes after you got out of college. So,
well, no, actually, it took much longer than that. It was about 10 or 12 years later, actually. But thank you for that compressed time frame. And where did your interest in food start?
Well, I've always been interested in food. From the time that I grew up and was getting stuff out of the garden. But we had some interesting places that we would go out to eat on rare occasions.
Right.
In Ripley, we had Dominic's Steakhouse, which I remember fondly.
Right.
I had no idea that I had no concept of nationalities. I am assuming now that Dominic was probably Italian, but he used T-bone steaks, and we would get a T-bone steak and a salad with Roquefort dressing and a baked potato, and the steak was always broiled with oregano, and that
definitely Italian.
A memorable meal as a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. I had another question for you, because I know that at one point in your career you were associated with a a man named J. Rockefeller, who was from the Rockefeller family, the obvious, the scion of the family, one of the scions of the family, and that he was the governor of the state of West Virginia, that he came to West Virginia for what reason?
He had been a high-up official in the Peace Corps at a very young age, and came back to West Virginia to do community service. And then he ran for the House of Delegates, and then from there to, I believe, Secretary of State of West Virginia. And that's when I got to know him. And then he ran for governor again successfully twice, and then for the United States Senate.
Right.
So
and then he was indeed a senator. Now, was he a senator with Senator Byrd?
He absolutely was. Senator Byrd was much his senior as a senator. Senator Byrd.
Now, we're for the folks who don't know what we're talking about, this is a man by the name of Robert Byrd who served in the Senate for how many years?
Well over 50 years.
50 years in the Senate, right? Yeah. And he was one of the towering figures in the history of the United States Senate.
He was majority leader for many years,
right?
And he stepped down as majority leader to become chairman of the Appropriations Committee because he could bring more money home to West Virginia. He told me about at that time that his goal was to bring $1 billion to West Virginia. And he told me about a year later, he said, I have exceeded my goal. I've brought in more than $1 billion for roads. And he brought in such things later as the FBI fingerprint and forensics center and many other things to West Virginia. But he was a great man.
What was great about him? Other than he was great for the state.
Well, he was brilliant, and he loved learning, and he took the responsibility of being a leader, a political leader, seriously. He told me once, he said, when other people jogged their bodies, I jogged my mind.
Mm.
And he had routines. For example, when he got a haircut, he told me he would always memorize a poem. When he did something else, he would memorize or learn something else.
Right.
He didn't go to movies. He didn't go to sporting events. He read.
Yeah.
And learned.
Yeah.
Remarkable guy.
And you told me a funny story once about when he was a senator and he was invited to the White House.
Well, that was actually the time he came to ask me to be a federal judge.
Oh.
He really didn't come and say, President Clinton wants to appoint you as a federal judge. He says, I want to make you a federal judge.
Right.
And, at the same conversation before we got to that serious moment, I asked him if he and Mrs. Byrd went to the White House. And he says, I used to. He said, I don't do it much anymore. He said, when you go over there now, the minute you step outside, the other senators run over you toward a TV camera and nothing productive gets done. And he said, Irma liked going there once for a party, but that was quite enough for her. And so they didn't go back. I don't know if this is interesting to you, Chris, but when Nixon was president, he had an opening on the United States Supreme Court, and he was having a difficult time filling it. And he tried to appoint a guy named Carswell, and a scandal ensued.
I remember that, yeah.
And he tried to appoint a distinguished judge from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that didn't go. And Senator Byrd had invited him to come to West Virginia to the Forest Festival. And so he was flying with Nixon on Air Force One down to Elkins for the Forest Festival. And Nixon said, I'm having a hell of a time, Robert, getting someone to be on the Supreme Court. Would you consider doing it? And Senator Byrd says, well, I got my law school at night while I've been in the Congress, but I've never practiced law. He said, let me talk to Irma. who was Mrs.
His
Byrd.
wife. Yep.
And he went home that night, talked to her, and he decided to pass the word back to Governor Connally of Texas, who was tight with Nixon, that he didn't feel qualified for the job. And then he looked at me and he said, "But I could have done it."
I bet he could have. I think he'd have made a great Supreme Court justice. Considering his erudition and his love of learning, he'd have been one of the great Supreme Court justices of history, probably.
I think he would have. He was one of the finer people I ever knew, much less a public servant. He was.
Yeah, he came from the town of what they call, where I come from, they call it Sophie. It's actually Sophia, Sophia, but they call it Sophie. And that's where I believe he was born and bred.
He was actually born in Virginia.
Oh.
His mother died, and his father couldn't afford to raise him. So he went to live with an uncle, or an aunt, rather, and changed his name from Sales, which was the name he was born with, to Byrd, which was the uncle's name, and grew up in Sophie.
Yeah.
And worked there and grew up in that very, very rural environment.
Very rural, yeah. Extremely, extremely.
Became a butcher.
Right.
And then he ran for the House of Delegates in West Virginia. He played the fiddle, and he ran all over playing
I
the
remember
fiddle.
him campaigning, playing the fiddle. He would always bring his fiddle along when he campaigned.
Yes, sir.
Well, this is a little lesson in West Virginia history, but also American history, folks. Also, I just wanted you to talk briefly, since we're in sort of adjacent to your throne, where you sit in judgment, Judge, and you were talking about the psychology of the way the court is structured, and exactly how it operates in terms of the psychology of it. Can you just run that by us once?
Well, it's important, and it's become less so as time goes on, and I think it's a bad thing. It used to be that if you went to a lawyer's office, you expected them to be wearing a coat and tie and dressed like a lawyer. It was sort of a uniform.
Right.
When I went to law school, you had to wear a coat and tie every day. We expect people in positions of authority or holding offices in our society to act and be in certain environments. The courtroom, as you're talking about, puts judges up on a bench at an elevation. If you think about it, we do that with lots of other officials or the heads of institutions we value. We put our preachers up on a higher level,
right? A pulpit, right?
Churches, and I think those totems of responsibility help develop and maintain the respect of the people who come to court. There's a big fad now, especially with the COVID pandemic, to do court proceedings by television. There's a lot of difference if you're a litigant and walking into a block room, cinder block room, and staring at a TV camera, as opposed to walking in my cherry paneled Robert C. Byrd funded fancy courtroom and looking up at the huge seal behind my chair and the flags on either side. Those things add a dignity and solemnity and importance to the function of government that I think is important to its existence. And
it also gives the litigants and the public a sense of that what is coming, the judgments that are coming down are fair. if not fair to everybody, at least fair given the circumstances.
We come to respect the courts. The Supreme Court, a good example, and this is not intended to be political, but it's been used as the best example, is the legitimacy of the United States Supreme Court was of great concern after they rendered their decision in the election dispute case of Bush versus Gore, because there was some debate about the credibility of the legal reasoning and a very sharply divided court. And yet, because the institution of the court over time had been so respected, and because we looked upon the court as the court and not a collection of politicians,
right?
We respected that decision, accepted it, and went on. I always resent it when somebody says, I was a Clinton judge, or one of my colleagues was a Bush judge. I can say this with absolute certainty. I've been a federal judge for 27 years. I have never known one of my colleagues, and I've had several now, that has rendered an opinion that I thought was even slightly political.
Wow. That's quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. Well, I'm going to conclude our very informative and interesting talk by asking you, returning to our original subject, what's the strongest memory you have growing up of food? The thing that you enjoyed the most, the thing that you has lingered with you, that whenever you taste it or you smell it or you see it, brings back that time in your life?
There are competing ones, but I would say the main one is my mother's cinnamon rolls.
Oh.
She made cinnamon rolls in an iron skillet in the oven. And, they were just butter, sugar, brown sugar, and cinnamon was a dough, but they were wonderful. That would be my tie to home and to family and
oh boy,
growing up.
That takes me back. Well, I'm so thankful that you were with us today, Joe. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in person.
I look forward to it as well. It's an honor being with you, Chris.
Oh, same here.
And I look forward to seeing you and Joe again soon.
Okay, buddy. Take care.
Take care.